master Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati had a strong desire to open preaching centers in the Western countries. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta had several times attempted to do this by sending sannyasis to England and other European countries, but Prabhupada noted, without any tangible results. I have come to this country with the same purpose in view, and as far as I can see, here in America, there is very good scope for preaching the cult of Lord Chaitanya. Prabhupada pointed out that there were certain Mayavadi groups who had buildings but were not attracting many followers. But he had talked with Swami Nikhilananda of the Ramakrishna mission, who had given the opinion that the Americans were suitable for Bhakti Yoga. I'm here and see a good field for work, but I'm alone, without men and money. To start a center here, we must have our own buildings. If the leaders of the Gaudiya Math would consider opening their own branch in New York, Srila Prabhupada would be willing to manage it. But without their own house, he reported, they could not conduct a mission in this city. Srila Prabhupada wrote that they could open centers in many cities throughout the country if his godbrothers would cooperate. He repeatedly made the point that although other groups did not have the genuine spiritual philosophy of India, they were buying many buildings. The Gaudiya Math, however, had nothing. If you agree to cooperate with me, as I have suggested above, then I shall extend my visa period. My present visa period ends by the end of this November. But I receive your confirmation immediately. Then I shall extend my visa period. Otherwise, I shall return to India. November 9, 6 p.m. While Prabhupada sat alone in his 5th floor room in Dr. Mishra's yoga studio, the lights suddenly went out. This was his experience of the first moments of the New York City blackout of 1965. In India, power failure occurred commonly. So Prabhupada, while surprised to find the same thing in America, remained undisturbed. He began chanting the Hare Krishna mantra on his beads. Meanwhile, outside his room, the entire New York metropolitan area had been plunged into darkness. The massive power failure had suddenly left the entire city without electricity, trapping 800,000 people in the subways and affecting more than 3 million people
30
in 9 states. 30 million people.
30 million.
30 million people in 9 states and 3 Canadian provinces. 2 hours later, a man from Dr. Mishra's apartment arrived at the door with candles and some fruit. He found Prabhupada in a pleasant mood, sitting there in the darkness, chanting Hare Krishna. The man informed him of the serious nature of such a blackout in New York City. Prabhupada thanked him and returned again to his chanting. The blackout lasted until 7 the next morning. Srila Prabhupada received a reply to his letter of November 8 to Tirtha Maharaj in Calcutta. Prabhupada had explained his hopes and plans for staying in America, but he had stressed that his godbrothers would have to give him their vote of confidence as well as some tangible support. His godbrothers had not been working cooperatively. Each leader was interested more in maintaining his own building than in working with the others to spread the teachings of Lord Chaitanya around the world. So how would it be possible for them to share Srila Prabhupada's vision of establishing a branch in New York City? They would see it as his separate
Attempt.
They would see it as his separate attempt. Yet, despite the unlikely odds, he appealed to their missionary spirit and reminded them of the desires of their spiritual master, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Their Guru Maharaja wanted Krishna consciousness to be spread in the West. But when Prabhupada finally got Tirtha Maharaj's reply, he found it unfavorable. His godbrother did not argue against his attempting something in New York, but he politely said that The Gaudiya Math funds could not be used for such a proposal. Prabhupada replied, "It is not very encouraging. Still, I am not a man to be disappointed." In fact, he found a little hope in Tirtha Maharaj's reply. So he described to his godbrother the property he had recently found for sale at 143 West 72nd Street. The building, only 18.5 feet wide and 100 feet deep, consisted of the first floor store, a basement, and a mezzanine. Prabhupada presented Tirtha Maharaj the price $100,000 with a $20,000 cash down payment, and remarked that this building was twice the size of the research institute in Calcutta. Prabhupada conceived of the basement as a kitchen and dining area, the first floor as a lecture hall, and the mezzanine as personal apartments with a separate area for the deity of Lord Krishna. Appropriately, Prabhupada had described himself as a man not to be disappointed. He was convinced that if there were a center where people could come hear from a pure devotee, the genuine God-conscious culture of India could begin in America. Yet because he had made his plans dependent on obtaining an expensive building in Manhattan, his goal seemed unreachable. Still, he was persistently writing to prominent devotees in India, though they were not interested in his plans. Why should they not help, he thought. After all, they were devotees of Krishna. Shouldn't the devotees come forward to establish the first Krishna temple in America? Certainly, he was qualified and authorized to spread the message of Krishna. As for the place, New York was perhaps the most cosmopolitan city in the world. He had found a building, not very expensive, a good location, and there was a great need for a Krishna temple here to offset the propaganda of the Indian Mayavadis. The Krishna Bhaktas to whom he was writing understood Lord Krishna to be not simply a Hindu deity, but the Supreme Lord, worshipable for the whole world. So they should be pleased to see Krishna worshipped in New York. Krishna himself said in the Bhagavad Gita, "Give up all other duties and surrender to me." So if they were Krishna's devotees, why would they not help? What kind of devotee was it who did not want to glorify the Lord? But Srila Prabhupada did not judge beforehand who would serve Krishna's mission and who would not. He was fully surrendered and fully dependent on Krishna, and in obedience to his spiritual master, he would approach everyone without discrimination to ask for help. There was Sumati Morarji. She had helped him in publishing the Bhagavatam, and she had sent him to America. In a recent letter to her, he had only given hints. "I'm just giving you the idea, and if you kindly think over the matter seriously and consult your beloved Lord Balakrishna, surely you will be further enlightened in the matter. There is scope and there is certainly necessity also, and it is the duty of every Indian, especially the devotees of Lord Krishna, to take up the matter." But he had received no reply. He had not heard from her since Butler, though her words to him had seemed prophetic, and they had stuck with him. "I feel that you should stay there until you fully recover from your illness and return only after you have completed your mission." Now Sumati Morarji must do something big. He told her point blank. "I think, therefore, that a temple of Balakrishna in New York may immediately be started for this purpose. And as a devotee of Lord Balakrishna, you should execute this great and noble work. Till now, there is no There is no worshipable temple of the Hindus in New York, although in India there are so many American missionary establishments and churches. So I shall request you to do this noble act, and it will be recorded in the history of the world that the first Hindu temple is started by a pious Hindu lady, Srimati Sumati Morarji, who is not only a big business magnate in India, but a pious Hindu lady and a great devotee of Lord Krishna. This task is for you, and glories at the same time. He assured her that he had no ambition to become the proprietor of a house. Could you please scroll down? Yeah. He assured her that he had no ambition. Okay. Prabhu, yeah, give me one sec, Prabhu. I'll get my book. He assured her that he had no ambition to become the proprietor of a house or temple in America, but for preaching, a building would be absolutely required. They should have association of bona fide devotees of the Lord. They should join the Kirtan glorifying the Lord. They should hear the teachings of Srimad Bhagavatam. They should have intimate touch with the temple or place of the Lord, and they should be given ample chance to worship the Lord in the temple. Under the guidance of a bona fide devotee, they can be given such facilities, and the way of the Srimad Bhagavatam is open for everyone. He informed her that he had located a building just suitable for this great missionary work. It was ideal, and if it was built for this purpose only. And your simple willingness to do the act will complete everything smoothly. The house is practically 3 stories, ground floor, basement, and 2 stories up, with all the suitable arrangements for gas, heat, etc. The ground floor may be utilized for preparation of prasadam of Krishna, because the preaching center will not be for dry speculation, but for actual gain. For delicious prasadam, I have already tested how the people here like the Can you hear me, Prabhu, now?
Yeah, Mataji.
Okay, sorry. He informed her that he had located a building just suitable for this great missionary work. It was ideal, as if it was built for this purpose only. And your simple willingness to do the act will complete everything smoothly. The house is practically 3 stories, ground floor, basement, and 2 stories up, with all the suitable arrangements for gas, heat, etc. The ground floor may be utilized for preparation of prasadam of Krishna, because the preaching center will not be for dry speculation, but for actual gain, for delicious prasadam. I have already tested how the people here like the vegetable prasadam prepared by me. They will forget meat eating and pay for the expenses. American people are not poor men like the Indians. And if they appreciate a thing, they are prepared to spend any amount on such hobby. They are being exploited simply by jugglery of words and bodily gymnastics, and still they are spending for that. But when they will have the actual commodity and feel pleasure by eating very delicious prasadam of Krishna, I'm sure a unique thing will be introduced in America. Now, according to his plans, he had a week left in America. My term to stay in America will be finished by the 17th of November, 1965. But I am believing in your foretelling. You should stay there until you fully recover your health and return after you have completed your mission. Tagore Society of New York cordially invites you to a lecture, God Consciousness by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Date Sunday, November 28, 1965. Time, lecture 3:30 p.m. Tea, 4:30 p.m. Place, New India House, 3 East 64th Street. A widely respected scholar and religious leader in India, Swami Bhaktivedanta is briefly visiting New York. He has been engaged in a monumental endeavor of translating the 60-volume Srimad Bhagavatam from Sanskrit to English. November 28. Dawood Harun had never met Srila Prabhupada. He was a musician living downtown, and he used to attend the meetings of the Tagore Society up on 64th Street. Dawood Harun. I went uptown and walked into the auditorium, and I noticed that the stage was empty and a few people were sitting towards the rear of the auditorium. I walked forward down the center aisle because I usually like to sit up front. Then I saw an old gentleman sitting over to the right, and he sort of drew me over to him. So I went over and sat beside him, and then I noticed that he was saying his beads. Even though he had his beads in a bag, I could hear them and I could see his body moving. And I felt very comfortable because this was something I was used to. As I was sitting there looking around the auditorium, he just turned around and smiled at me very nicely. He nodded his head and I nodded my head, and he smiled and I turned around. Then he turned back to me again and softly asked me if I was from India. I said, "No, sir, I'm not from India. I'm from here, the United States." He turned back and he kept chanting with his beads. Then he turned around the next time and asked if I was a Hindu. I said, "No, sir, I'm not a Hindu. I'm a Muslim." And he said, "Oh, very good, very good. Yes, many times I hear the children in India reciting the Quran." And then he turned back around and his body was moving, rocking, and he was working with his beads. Then there were a few more exchanges of pleasantries, sort of intermittent. And then a lady came up on the stage and announced that the lecture was to begin. And if the folks could give the speaker a round of applause, they would welcome him to the stage. At that point, the man I was sitting next to put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Excuse me, sir, could you do me a favor?" And I said, "Yes, anything." He said, "Would you watch over my books?" I looked down on the floor and he had several boxes of books and an umbrella and several other articles. I said, "Yes, I would watch over these." And he said, "Excuse me." He walked up the aisle and surprisingly, he walked up on the stage. And it was the man I had come to hear, Swami Bhaktivedanta. He walked up on the stage and introduced himself to the people and tried to get them to come forward. He said, "Come forward, come forward." A few of them came up to the front. There were mixed couples, many Indians, male and female, mostly middle-aged and some college-aged. A lot of professor types and ladies were there. Then he began his speech. He dove right into it. He just started explaining, exclaiming, proclaiming the greatness of the Creator, and that the most important thing is to remember the Creator and remember God. He began to expand on God consciousness, what God consciousness is, and how God is everywhere, and how it behooves us all to remember God, no matter what we call Him, what names we call Him by, but that we should call Him. He gave a demonstration which was very moving. He chanted Hare Krishna, Hare Rama, and spoke about the power and saving grace in the mantra. He took a little break about halfway through and had some water. The last thing he said as he was coming down from the podium was that he had copies of the Srimad Bhagavatam. He explained that he had been working on them and that they came in 3 volumes and were $16. $16 for 3 copies. Then he concluded and came down. A lot of people went over to him. Some were timid, some were enthusiastic. Some people shook his hand and were asking for books. At first, there were about 15 people gathered around him, talking to him and asking questions. With so many people around, he came over to me and said, "Sir, would you do me one more favor? Will you kindly take over the selling of the books? People will be coming to you for the books. So you sell the books and put the money in this little box, and I will be with you in a minute." I said, "Fine." So while he talked to the people, others came up to me. They must have thought I was somehow his secretary or his traveling companion. And people were coming over to me and asking me personal questions about him, which I couldn't really answer because I didn't know. Some people were buying the books or looking through them. So this went on, and I was trying to listen to him carry on his conversations with people and carry on the book selling at the same time. Some of the people were looking for a guru and trying to find out what he was supposed to be. Some of them were really interrogating him, but he just smiled and answered all their questions simply. I remember he told them, "You will know. There is no pressure. You will know if I am your guru." He suggested that people go over and read the books. And then the group dwindled down to about half a dozen, and the few remaining were just looking at him, and some were too timid to approach him. He walked over to them and spoke to them, putting them at ease. Later he came over and we counted the collection, and I helped him pack up his box and carry downstairs of the boxes of books that were left. As we parted, he thanked me very much, and I gave him my name and address and phone number and purchased a set of the Srimad Bhagavatams. Should I continue chapter 4, Prabhu?
Want to say something, Mataji?
Yeah. Yes, Prabhu. So I think the visa date was coming ended to Prabhupada. So he wrote a letter to Morarji. So he was really asking to help him. And he was not actually disappointed. So he's so positive that, and he also saw how he can make this America better with the preaching, because he saw that there is a possibility. So I really like that positive attitude from Prabhupada. So, and this this person, who is that? That Dawood Haran, Prabhupada made him as books to sell his books. So it was very nice, and the way he was gently talking, I really liked it. Yeah, so Prabhupada started his lectures or like preaching or talking about or distributing the books.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Continue, Prabhu.
Uttara?
Mr. Prabhu, if you want to go ahead, you can go ahead.
It will not be possible to assist you. Chapter 15. From a letter to Sumati Morarji. I have come here in this old age neither for sightseeing nor for any personal interest. It is for the interest of the entire humanity that I am trying to implement the science of Krishna, which will actually make them happy. So it's a duty of every devotee of Lord Krishna to help me by all means. November passed and December came, and Prabhupada, having obtained an extension on his visa, stayed on. America seemed so opulent, yet many things were difficult to tolerate. The sirens and bells from fire engines and police cars seemed like they would crack his heart. Sometimes at night, he would hear a person being attacked and crying for help. From his first days in the city, he had noted that the smell of dog stool was everywhere. And although it was such a rich city, he could rarely find a mango to purchase. And if he did, it was very expensive and usually had no taste. From his room, he would sometimes hear the horns of ocean liners, and he would dream that someday he would sail around the world with a Sankirtan party, preaching in all major cities of the world. So the weather went below freezing, colder than he had ever experienced in India. Daily, he had to walk toward the Hudson against a west wind, and that even on ordinary winter's day would take your breath away and make your eyes water and your face grow numb. On a stormy day, the driving wind and sudden gusts could even knock a man down. Sometimes a cold rain would turn the streets slick with ice. The cold would become especially severe as one approached the shelterless, windswept area of West Side Drive, where occasional whirlwinds carried brown leaves and pepper trash mysteriously high into the air. Srila Prabhupada wore a coat Dr. Misha had given, but he never gave up wearing his dhoti despite the cold, windy walks. Swami Nikhinalanda of the Ramakrishna Mission had advised Prabhupada that if he wanted to stay in the that he wanted to stay in the West, he should abandon his traditional Indian dress and strict vegetarianism. Meat eating and liquor, as well as pants and coat, were almost a necessity in this climate, he had said. Before Prabhupada had left India, one of his godbrother has demonstrated to him how he should eat in the West with a knife and fork. But Prabhupada never considered taking on Western ways. His advisors cautioned him not to remain an alien, but to get into the spirit of American life. Even if it meant breaking vows he had held in India. Almost all Indian immigrants compromised their old ways. But Prabhupada's idea was different. He could not be budged. The others may have had to compromise, he thought, but they had come to beg technological knowledge from the West. I have not come to beg something, he said, but to give something. So in his solitary wanderings, Srila Prabhupada made acquaintance with a number of local people. There was Mr. Ruben, a Turkish Jew. One second, Mataji. In his solitary wanderings, Srila Prabhupada made acquaintance with a number of local people. There was Mr. Rubin, a Turkish Jew who worked as a New York City subway contractor. Mr. Rubin met Prabhupada on a park bench and, being a sociable fellow and a world traveler, sat and talked with Indian holy man, Mr. Rubin. He seemed to know that he would have temples filled up with devotees. He would look out and say, I'm not a poor man, I'm rich. There are temples and books, they are existing and they are there, but the time is separating us from them. He always mentioned we and spoke about the time is the one who sent him is his spiritual master. He did not know people at that time, but he said, I'm never alone. He always looked like a lonely man to me. That's what made me think of him like a holy man, Elia, who always went alone. I don't believe he had any followers. When the weather was not rainy or icy, Prabhupada would catch the bus to Grand Central Station and visit the Central Library on 42nd Street. His Srimad Bhagavatam were there. Some of the same volumes he had sold to the US Embassy in New Delhi, and he took pleasure in seeing them listed in the card catalog and learned that they were being regularly checked out and read. He would sometimes walk through UN Plaza or walk up to New India House on 64th Street, where he had met Mr. Malhotra, a consulate officer. It was through Malhotra that he had contacted the Tagore Society and had secured an invitation to lecture before one of their meetings back in November. Riding the bus down Fifth Avenue, he would look out at the buildings and imagine that someday they could be used in Krishna consciousness. He would take a special interest in certain buildings, one on 23rd Street and one with a dome on 14th Street attracted his attention. He would think of how the Metalists had constructed such elaborate buildings and had yet made no provisions for spiritual life. Despite all the great achievements of technology, people felt empty and useless. They had built these great buildings, but the children are going to LSD. December 2nd, November 2 headlines say, New York City hospitals report marked rise in LSD cases admitted for care. Protests against US participation in Vietnam War mounts. So the weather grew cold, but there was no snow in December. On Columbus Avenue, shops were selling Christmas trees, and the continental restaurants were bright with holiday lighting. On 72nd, the Retailers Association erected a tall red post topped with green tinsel Christmas trees. The top of the trees on both sides of the street sprouted tinsel garlands that spanned the street and joined in red tinsel stars surrounded by colored lights. Although Srila Prabhupada did no Christmas shopping, he visited many bookstores, Orientalia, Sam Wizards, Doubleday, Paragon, and others, trying to sell his Srimad Bhagavatams. Mrs. Faber, the wife of the Paragon Book Gallery proprietor, considered Prabhupada a pleasant and extremely polite small gentleman. The first time he called, she wasn't interested in his books, but he tried again, and she took several volumes. Prabhupada used to stop by about once a week. Sometimes Prabhupada used to stop about once a week since his books were selling regularly. He would collect. Sometimes when he needed copies to sell personally, he would come by and pick them up from Mrs. Ferber. And sometimes he would phone to ask her how his books were selling. Mrs. Ferber. Every time he would ask for a glass of water. If a customer would make such a request, I would ordinarily say, there's the water cooler. But because he was an old man, I could not tell him that, of course. He was very polite always, very modest and a great scholar. So whatever he would ask, I would fetch him a cup of water personally. Once Prabhupada was talking with Mrs. Ferber about Indian cuisine, and she mentioned that he especially likes samosas. So the next time he paid her a visit, he brought a tray of samosas, which she enjoyed. Harvey Cohen came often to room 501 to visit the Swami who had so impressed him at Anandashram. Harvey. The room he occupied was a tiny office in the back of Yoga Society in Uptown Manhattan. I began to go there regularly, and we sat facing each other on the floor in this little office with his typewriter and a new tape recorder on top of 2 suitcases. And there was a box of books he had brought from India and a colored reproduction of dancing figures, which he looked at often. I told Swami Bhaktivedanta that I was an artist, and he asked me to please paint the pictures of the dances, which he explained was of Lord Chaitanya and his disciples. The painting was called Sanketan. Whenever I came to visit him, Swami would always be happy to see me. I told him about myself, and we chanted Hare Krishna together in his room many nights that winter. I would get the train uptown from my apartment to go see him. January 11, 1966. So we moved to January. Yeah? Prabhupada, Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri died of heart attack while visiting Russia. The Prime Minister had been a personal acquaintance of Srila Prabhupada in India and an admirer of his Srimad Bhagavatam translation. He has been scheduled to visit America, and Prabhupada had expected to obtain a personal sanction from him for the release of funds from India. His ultimate death was a great upset in Srila Prabhupada's plans to purchase a building at 143 72nd West 72nd Street. The realtors had shown him the building, and he had already mentally designed the interior for deity worship and distribution of prasada. The money was to come from India, and Prime Minister Shastri was to give personal sanction for release of the funds. But suddenly that was all changed. January 14, Prabhupada decided to write to the owner of the building, Mr. A.M. Hartman. He explained that how his plan had been upset, and he posed a new plan. Now the Prime Minister, Mr. Lal Bahadur Shastri, suddenly dead, and I'm greatly perplexed as there is now great difficulty for getting money from India. I'm requesting you to allow me to use the place for the International Institution for God Consciousness, at least for some time. The house is lying vacant for so many days without any use. I learned that you're paying the taxes, insurance, and other charges for the house, although you have no income from there. If you, however, allow this place for this public institution, you shall at least save the taxes and other charges which you are paying now for nothing. If I can start the institution immediately, certainly I shall be able to get sympathy locally. And in that case, I may not be required to get money from India. I'm also requesting that Your Honor become one of the directors of this public institution, because he will give a place to start the institution. A.M. Hartman was not interested. On the same day, he wrote, Mr. Hartman, Prabhupada received a letter from Sri Padmapad Singhania, the director of very large JK organization in India. Prabhupada had written Sri Padmapad ji for financial support, and his reply gave him no hope. Not only was the Singhania family fabulously wealthy, but its members were devotees of Lord Krishna. My dear Swamiji, I have gone through your letter. I am very glad to know your idea of erecting Sri Radhakrishna temple in New York. I think the proposal is a good one, but the following are the difficulties. Number one, we have got to send foreign exchange for building the temple, for which government sanction is required. Without government sanction, no money can be sent abroad. If the government of India agrees, then one can think of erecting a temple in New York. Number two, I doubt whether this small amount of rupees 7 lakhs, which is like $110,000, a temple can be built in New York City. I meant to carry out a nice construction with the Indian type of architecture. To get a temple completed in Indian type of architecture, we have to send a man from India. These are the two main difficulties. Otherwise, your idea is very good. Srila Prabhupada and Mr. Sangania had a basic disagreement. A magnificent Indian temple in New York would cost many millions of dollars to construct. Prabhupada knew, of course, that if Padmapad Singhania wanted, he could provide millions of dollars. But then, how would they get so much money out of India? Prabhupada therefore again suggested that they spend only 7 lakhs after purchasing the house. He wrote, we can build another story upon it when the temple dome, with the temple dome, chakra, etc. Prabhupada had his own line of reasoning. Lord Dwarkadish exhibited his opulence at Dwarka with 16,000 queens, and it is understood that he built a palace for each and every queen. And the palaces were made with jewels and stones, so that there was no necessity for artificial lights in the palaces. So your conception of building a temple of Lord Krishna is an opulence. But we are residents of Vrindavan. Vrindavan has no palaces like your Dwarka. Vrindavan is full of forest and cows on the bank of the Jamuna, and Lord Krishna in his childhood played the part of a cowherd boy without any royal opulence as you people, the inhabitants of Dwarka, are accustomed. So, when the Dwarka Valas meet the Vrindavan Valas, there may be a via media. With Sir Padmapad's Dwarka like wealth and Srila Prabhupada's Vrindavan like devotion, Lord Krishna, the Lord of both Vrindavan and Dwarka, could be properly worshipped. January 21, he received Bon Maharaj's reply. 2 weeks before, Prabhupada returned to his godbrother, the director of the Institute of Oriental Philosophy in Vrindavan, that he had found a place for a temple in New York, and that He wanted to install deities of Radha Krishna. In his reply, Bon Maharaj quoted price estimates for 14-inch brass deities of Radha Krishna, but he also warned that to begin deity worship would be a heavy responsibility. Srila Prabhupada responded, I think that after the temple has started, some men, even from America, may be available. As I see, they have at Ramakrishna mission, as well as in so many, yoga societies. So I'm trying to open a temple here because Srila Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati wanted it. Prabhupada also requested Bon Maharaj's assistance in getting the government to sanction release of the money he felt Padmapa Singhania would donate. He mentioned that he had carried on an extensive personal correspondence with the Vice President of India, Dr. Radhakrishna, who was also known to Bon Maharaj. Tell him that this is not an ordinary temple of worship, but an international institution for God consciousness based on the Srimad Bhagavatam. January 22nd. When Srila Prabhupada prayed to receive Radhakrishna in New York, a snowstorm hit the city. That morning, Srila Prabhupada, who had perhaps never seen snow, woke and thought that someone had whitewashed the side of the building next door. Not until he went outside did he discover that it was snow. The temperature was 10 degrees. The city went into a state of emergency, but Prabhupada continued his daily walks. Now he had to walk through heavy snow, only a thin dhoti beneath his overcoat, his head covered with his Swami hat. The main roads were cleared, but many sidewalks were covered with snow. Although the strip of the park dividing Broadway, the gusting winds piled snowbanks to shoulder height and buried the benches. The Broadway kiosks, plastered with layers of posters and notices, were now plastered with additional layers of snow and ice. But despite the weather, New Yorkers still walk their dogs, the pets, now wearing raincoats and mackinacs. Such pampering by American dog owners left Prabhupada with the feeling of surprised amusement. As he approached the West End Avenue, he found the doorman blowing whistles to signal taxis as usual, but also scattering salt to melt the ice and create safe sidewalks in front of the buildings. In Riverside Park, the benches, pathways, and the trees were glazed with ice and gave off a shimmering reflection from the city. In the news, Selective Service officials announced the first substantial increase in the draft since the Korean War. A month-long peace ended with the US Air Force bombing North Vietnam. The New York transit strike ended after 3 weeks, and the transit labor leader died in jail of a heart attack. January 30. The East Coast was hit by several severe blizzards. 7 inches of snow fell on the city with winds up to 50 miles an hour. The city of New York offered warm rooms and meals for people living in tenements without heat. JFK Airport was closed, as were train lines and roadways into the city. For the second time within 8 days, a state of emergency was declared because of snow. As a lone individual, Prabhupada could not do anything about the snow emergency or the international warfare. He saw these as mere symptoms of the age of Kali. Always there would be misery in the material world. But if you could bring Radha Krishna into a building in New York, nothing was impossible for the Supreme Lord. Even in the midst of Kali Yuga, a golden age could appear and people get relief. If Americans could take to Krishna consciousness, the whole world would follow. Seeing through the eyes of the scripture, Srila Prabhupada pushed on through the blizzard and pursued the twin trailer for support of his Krishna consciousness mission. February 4. He wrote again to Tirtha Maharaj, who had agreed to try for the government sanctions if he first received written confirmation from a responsible donor pledging the funds for a temple. Prabhupada informed him that the donor would be Sri Padmapa Singhania, and he enclosed Mr. Singhania's favorable letter of the 14th. Prabhupada reminded his godbrother. He says, Srila Prabhupada Bhaktisiddhanta wanted such temples in foreign cities like New York, London, Tokyo, etc. And I had personal talks with him when I first met him at Altadanga in 1922. Now here is a chance for me to carry out his transcendental order. I'm just seeking your favor and mercy in making this attempt successful. February 5. Discouragement came to the plans of Srila Prabhupada had formed around the promise of support by Prabhupada Singhania. The Dwarkavalas wrote to express his dissatisfaction with the 72nd Street building. He says, I'm afraid that I cannot agree with your suggestion that you should buy a small house and erect something on top of it. Unfortunately, such a kind of proposal will not suit me. The temple must be a small one, but it must be constructed properly. I quite agree that you cannot spend a lot of money at present, but within the amount the government may sanction, you should build something according to the architecture of Indian temples. Then only we will be able to create some impression on the American people. This is all I can write to you in this connection. I'm very grateful for you taking the trouble of writing me. Prabhupada did not take this letter as final. He maintained hope that Sri Padmapad Singhania would still give money for the temple, for only if only the transfer of money could be arranged. He continued writing his god brothers and other devotees, asking them to try to secure the government's sanction. He maintained his same aspirations, even though his sole prospective donor had rejected his scheme of chakra and dome atop of conventional two-story building. February 15, he moved from room 501 downstairs 2 floors to a room all his own. Okay, finally he got his room. I have changed my room to 307 in the same building as above mentioned for better air and light. It is on the roadside junction of 2 roads, Columbus Avenue and 72nd Street. According to Dr. Mishra, Prabhupada moved in order to have his own place independent of the Mishra Yoga Society. 16. Prabhupada wrote to the proprietors of the Universal Book House of Bombay, giving some hints for selling his Srimad Bhagavatam in the Bombay area. He explained that he was trying to establish a Radha Krishna temple and that a big industrialist of India has promised to pay for the cost. Since it seemed that he might stay in the United States for many more days, he wanted the book house to take the increased charge of selling his books throughout India. They were his agent for selling his books in Maharashtra, but now he recommended they take the responsibility in all provinces and introduce his books in colleges and universities throughout India. He also requested they create his bank account there for the books sold so far. This is interesting. He is doing everything on one person. February 26, Mr. A.P. Darwadkar of the Universal Book House replied, I cannot give you a very happy news on the progress of the sale of Srimad Bhagavatam because the subject is religious and only a small section of society may personally be interested in the books. We tried to push them through some booksellers to Nagpur, Ahmedabad, Pune, etc. But regret to inform you that after some time, these booksellers returned the books for want of response. As such, we are not only unenthusiastic to agree to your proposal of taking up sales for all India, but we were just thinking of requesting you to nominate some other people in our place to represent your sale program in Maharashtra. So far, they had sold only 6 sets of his books, for which they were about to transfer rupees 172 to his account. This was hardly encouraging to the other. Again, India was not interested, even in the land of religion. Religious subjects are only for a small section of society. March 4. Another reverse. On February 8, Srila Prabhupada had returned to India's new Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, requesting her to sanction the release of money from India. A reply dated February 25, New Delhi, came from the Prime Minister's official secretary, Mr. L.K. Gah. It goes, Dear Swamiji, the Prime Minister has seen your letter of February 8, 1966. She appreciates the spirit which prompted you to carry the spiritual message of Srimad Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam to other countries. Owing to the critical foreign exchange situation which the country is facing, it is greatly regretted that it will not be possible to assist you from here in your plan to set up a Radha Krishna temple. But Prabhupada had other hopes. After writing to the Prime Minister, he had written again to Tet Maharaj asking him to request Dr. Radhakrishnan to persuade the government to sanction the release of funds. He waited for 1 month, no answer. Apparently, his godbrothers felt little obliged towards preaching in America. He had written that he needed encouragement from them to continue in America because it was so expensive. He had explained that he was spending the equivalent of 1,000 rupees a month. As such, I'm counting every day to receive favorable replies, but there was no reply. March 18. He wrote again to Sri Padmapa Singhania, requesting him to send a man from India to supervise work on the temple in New York, as Mr. Singhania had previously suggested. But there is no record of any reply to this request. Prabhupada wrote again to Sumati Morarji, requesting her to please send him a mridanga to accompany his chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra. He also requested her that in the future, when he would send many men from India, she obliged by giving them free passage on Sindhya steamship lines. No reply. As his financial situation became more urgent and his hopes more strained, his support from India withdrew in silence, and his answered correspondence was itself a kind of message, loud and clear, we cannot help you. Although no one can be encouraged, Srila Prabhupada trusted in the order of his spiritual master on the will of Krishna. The word from the Prime Minister regarding government sanction had been a definite no, but he had received another extension of his visa. Now his last hope was Sri Padmapa Singhania. Prabhupada knew that he was so influential a man in India that if he wanted, he could send the money. And he was Prabhupada's final hope. 1 second, Mathais. April 2, Singhania did not reply personally. He had his secretary, Mr. Ishwaraya, write to Prabhupada, thoroughly discouraging his last hopes of purchasing a building in New York. I regret to write that Sri Padmapaj is not interested in the scheme of building a Radhakrishna temple in New York at present. In regard to the inquiry contained in the last paragraph of your letter, Sri Padmapaji duly received books of Srimad Bhagavatam from your Delhi office. He was faithfully. Seeing from a distance a tiny figure walking Manhattan streets and avenues among many other tiny figures, a foreigner whose visa had almost run out, we come upon only the external appearance of Srila Prabhupada. These days of struggle were real enough and very difficult. But his transcendental consciousness was always predominant. He was not living in Manhattan consciousness, but was absorbed in dependence upon Krishna. Just as when on the Jaladuta he had suffered his heart attacks, his reading of Chaitanya Charitamrita had supplied him the nectarine of life. So this is how we should also continue. We should take up the mission and just raise our consciousness up, although it might look like at least impractical and all those things. He had already succeeded. Certainly, he wanted to provide Radha and Krishna temple in New York, but his success was that he was remembering Krishna even in the New York City in the winter of 1965-66, whether the world recognized him or not. Not a day went by when he did not work on Krishna's book, Srimad Bhagavatam. And not a day went by when he did not offer food to Krishna and speak on Krishna's philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. Lord Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, "Forward, who sees me everywhere and sees everything in me, I'm never lost to him, and he is never lost to me." And Krishna assures his pure devotees that my devotee will never be vanquished. There was never any doubt about this for Prabhupada. The only question was whether Americans would take notice of the pure devotee in their midst. At this point, It seemed that no one was going to take him seriously. Going on, chapter 16, free to preach. Here I am now sitting in New York, the world's greatest city, such a magnificent city, but my heart is always hankering after that Vrindavana. I shall be very happy to return to my Vrindavana, that sacred place. But then, why are you here? Now, because it is my duty. I have brought some message for you people because I have been ordered by my superior, my spiritual master. Whatever you have learned, you should go to the Western countries and you must distribute this knowledge. So, in spite of all my difficulties, all my inconveniences, I'm here because I am obliged by duty. From a lecture by Srila Prabhupada. Room 307 was never meant for use as a residence or ashram or lecture hall. It was only a small, narrow office without furniture or a telephone. Its door held a large pane of frosted glass, the kind common in old offices. Above the door was a glass pane transom. Prabhupada placed his blankets on the floor before his metal footlocker, which now became a makeshift desk where he write. He slept on the floor. There were no facilities here for cooking or even for bathing. So daily he had to walk to Dr. Mishra's apartment. So basically this room is not a place to live. When he had lived in room 501 at Dr. Mishra's yoga ashram, Dr. Mishra had financed his needs. But now Prabhupada was on his own, and whatever he could raise by selling his books, he would have to use for his daily maintenance and for the monthly rent of $72. $72 rent. He noted that for a little powdered chili, the Western superette charged 25 cents, 10 times what he would have paid in India. He had no guaranteed income. His expenses has increased and his physical comforts had reduced, but at least he had his own place. Now he was free to preach as he liked. He had come to America to speak about Krishna, and even from the beginning he had found the opportunity to do so, whether at an informal get-together in the Agarwal's living room or before a formal gathering at the Butler Lions Club, Dr. Norman Brown's Sanskrit class, Mishra's Yoga Society, or the Tagore Society. But he did not attach much importance to lecturing, where the people who gathered would hear him only once. This was the main reason he wanted his own building in New York, so that people could come regularly, chant Hare Krishna, take prasadam in his company, and hear him speak from Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. Moving out of the yoga studio into the small office downstairs gave Prabhupada what he was looking for, his own place. But not even euphemistically could that place be called a temple. His name was on the door. Anyone seeking him there could find him. But who would come there? By its opulence and beauty, a temple was supposed to attract people to Krishna. But room 307 was just the opposite. It was bare poverty. Even a person interested in spiritual topics would find it uncomfortable to sit on the ruggles floor of a room shaped like a narrow railroad car. So one of Dr. Mishra's students had donated reel-to-reel tape recorder, and Prabhupada recorded some of his solitary bhajans, which he sang to his own accompaniment of hand symbols. He also recorded a long philosophical essay, Introduction to Gita Upanishad. So, dear devotees, this is the, we have this introduction to Gita, right? In the first 30 pages in the Gita. So, this is the recording. The recording Prabhupada did here became the introduction to our Gita. Introduction to Gita, even if no one attends, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had told him he can go on chanting to the four walls. But since he was now free to speak his message in the new situation Gita had provided, he decided to lecture 3 evenings a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, to whomever would come. So his first audience consisted mainly of people who had heard about him or met him at Dr. Mishra's yoga studio. And despite the poverty of his room, the meeting became a source of new life for him. The meetings. So when he gave this class on the introduction to Gita, nobody came. But since Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur said, speak to the walls, he spoke to the walls. And that recording has become the worldwide treasure for all the devotees now. It's so beautiful introduction. March 18, he expresses optimism in a letter to Sumati Morarji. I was very much encouraged when you wrote to say, I feel that you should stay there until you fully recover from your illness and return only after you have completed your mission. I think these lines dictated by you are the words of Lord Balakrishna expressed through your goodness. You'll be pleased to know that I have improved my health back to normal and my missionary work is nicely progressing. I hope my project to start a temple of Shri Radha Krishna will also be realized by the grace of the Lord. Since I came to New York from Butler, Pennsylvania, I have rented the above room at $72 per month, and I'm delivering lectures in the Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam, accompanied by Sankirtan, and American ladies and gentlemen come to hear me. You will be surprised to know that they do not understand the language of Sankirtan, yet they hear with attention. The movement which I have started here is a completely new to them because Americans are generally acquainted with the Indian yoga gymnastics as performed by some Indian yogis here. They have never heard of Bhakti cult of the science of Krishna before, and still they're hearing me. This is a great success for me. Outside the closed windows of room 307, the late winter night has fallen. Prabhupada's words are punctuated with the muted sounds of car horns and occasional sirens from the street, sometimes by the street chords of a lonely foghorn of the Hudson. Although bare, the room is warm. Prabhupada is speaking on the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, Arjuna is perplexed about whether to fight or not to fight. After seeing in front of him his relatives with whom he was to fight, he was perplexed. And there was some argument with Krishna. Now here is the point. Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead. Prabhupada voice is earnest and persuading. Sometimes his speech becomes high-pitched and break through with urgency. His British cultured diction bears a heavy Bengali accent. Suddenly, he pauses in his lecture and addresses someone in the room. Prabhupada, what's that? Man, what? Prabhupada, what is this book? Response is, well, that is a translation of Bhagavad Gita. So Prabhupada is obviously displeased that while he is speaking, someone is looking through a book. This is hardly like the respect offered to learned speakers described in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada, well, no, you can hear me. Man, I'm hearing. Prabhupada, yes, don't turn your attention, just hear me. He's taking the role of teacher, correcting his students. Of course, there is no compelling reasons why any of his casual guests should feel obliged to obey him. He simply begs for their attention and yet demands it, just hear me, as he attempts to convince them of Krishna consciousness. You have heard that one must accept the spiritual master after careful examination, just as one selects a bride or bridegroom after careful examination. In India, they're very careful because the marriage of boys and girls takes place under the guidance of the parents, so the parents very carefully see to it. Similarly, one has to accept the spiritual master. It is necessary. According to Vedic injunction, everyone should have a spiritual master. Perhaps you have seen a sacred thread. We have got a sacred thread. Mr. Cohen, have you seen sacred thread? Prabhupada pauses. His audience has not noted the thin white cords he wears beneath his shirt across the upper part of his body. For thousands of years, Brahmanas in India have worn such threads placed diagonally across the torso, looped around the left shoulder and down to the right waist. A Brahmana holds his thread in his right hand while chanting the sacred Gayatri mantra 3 times a day. But this is all strange indeed to Americans. Prabhupada himself is exotic to them. His grey chadar wrapped around his shoulders. He sits cross-legged and erect on a thin pillow, and they sit facing him on the other side of his trunk, which now serves as a desk and lectern. They are close together in the narrowness of the room. He is frail and small and foreign to them, yet somehow he is completely assured in a way that has nothing to do with being a foreigner in New York. Visitors sense his strong presence. 2 white linens of clay run neatly vertical on his forehead. His pale peach claws are gathered in loose folds around his body. He pauses only a few seconds to inquire whether they have seen a sacred thread. So that sacred thread is a sign that a person has a spiritual master. Here, of course, there is no such distinction. But according to Hindu system, a married girl also has some sign so that people can understand that this girl is married. She wears a red mark so that others may know that she is married. And according to the division in the hair, what is that line called? My man says part. Part. What is the spelling? P-A-R-T. Prabhupada, part. Yeah. This parting also has some meaning. They know English and he knows Gita, but he knows a good deal of English, whereas they know practically nothing of the Gita, which he has to spoon feed to them. But occasionally he asks their help in English vocabulary. When the part is in the middle, then the girl has her husband, and she is coming from a respectable family. And if the part is here, then she is prostitute. With a slight gesture, he raises his right hand toward, but never really reaching his head, yet somehow the half gesture clearly indicates a part on the side of the head. Then again, when a girl is well dressed, it should be understood that she has her husband at home. And when she is not well dressed, it is to be understood that her husband is away from home. You see? And a widow's dress. There are so many symptoms. Similarly, the sacred thread is a sign that a person has accepted a spiritual master, just as the red mark symbolizes that a girl has a husband. Although his audience may be momentarily enamored by what appears to be a description of Indian social customs, a careful listener grasps the greater context of Srila Prabhupada's speech. Everyone must accept a spiritual master. It's a heavy topic for a casual audience. What's the need of taking spiritual master? Isn't this just for India? But he says everyone should have spiritual master. What is spiritual master anyway? Maybe he means that accepting spiritual master is just another cultural item from Hinduism, like the thread or the part in woman's hair or the widow's dress. So the audience can easily regard his discussion as a kind of cultural exposition, just as one comfortably watches a film about the living habits of people in foreign land. And although one has no intention of adopting those habits as one's own. But the Swami is wearing one of those threads on his body, but that's for Hindus, and it doesn't mean that Americans should wear them. But these Hindu beliefs are interesting. So this is how Prabhupada is inaugurating or penetrating the preaching of Krishna consciousness into the Western world, opposite side of the world, coming from the East. Actually, Prabhupada has no motive but to present the absolute truth as he heard it in disciple succession. But if anyone in that railroad car-shaped room were to ask himself, should I surrender to his spiritual master? He would be confronted by the existential presence of a genuine guru. One is free to regard his talk as one likes. So in every step of one's life, the spiritual master guides. Now, to give such a guidance, a spiritual master should be a very perfect man. Otherwise, how can he guide? Now, here Arjuna knows that Shri Krishna is a perfect person. So therefore, he is accepting him. Sishyas teham sadimam dvam prapannam. Sanskrit, no one knows a word of it. But there is never any question for Srila Prabhupada. Even if they don't understand it, the transcendental sound of Shastra will purify them. It is his authority and he cannot omit it. And even at its first impression, it presents an air of scholarly authority, the original, the foreign words of the sages. I'm just surrendering unto you, and you accept me as your disciple, Arjuna says. Friendly talks cannot make a solution perplexity. Friendly talks may be going on for years together, but no solution. So here, Arjuna accepts Krishna as a spiritual master. This means that whatever Krishna will dictate, he has to accept. One cannot deny the order of the spiritual master. Therefore, one has to select a spiritual master by whose order one will not commit a mistake. Suppose you accept the wrong person as a spiritual master and he guides you wrongly, then your whole life is spoiled. So one has to accept a spiritual master whose guidance will make one's life perfect. That is the relationship between spiritual master and disciple. It's not a formality, it's a great responsibility, both for the disciple and for the spiritual master. Yes, student, but if the disciple is in ignorance before, Prabhupada, yes, Prabhupada acknowledges a serious question. It is for answering questions like this from disciple in ignorance that he has left retirement in India and come to America. Student, how does he know which master to choose? Because he doesn't have the knowledge to make a wise decision. Prabhupada, yes. So the first thing is that one should be searching after a spiritual master. Just as you search after some school, you must at least have some preliminary knowledge of what a school is. You cannot search for a school and go to a clothes shop. If you are so ignorant that you do not know what is school, what is clothes shop, it is very difficult for you. You must know at least what a school is. So that knowledge is like this. Tad gujnanadam sagurum eva bigachet samatpani shrotriyam brahmanistam. According to this verse, the spiritual master is required for a person who is inquisitive about transcendental knowledge. There is another verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam. Tasmad gurum prapadyeta jijnashu sheyottamam. One should search after a spiritual master if one is inquisitive about transcendental subject matters. Unless one is at least conversant with preliminary knowledge of transcendental matters, how can he inquire from the spiritual master? So his questioner seems satisfied. So the lecture is not a prepared speech on a specific subject. Though grave, thorough in scholarship, it ranges over several philosophical points. Yet he never pauses, groping for words. He knows exactly what he wants to say, and it is only a question of how much his audience can take. But sometimes his mood is light, and he commiserates with his fellow New Yorkers, chuckling about the difficulties they share. Suppose there's a heavy snowfall. The whole New York City is flooded with snow, and you're all put into inconvenience. This is sort of suffering, but you have no control over it. Sometimes he praises Dr. Mishra's students for having learned so nicely from their teacher. Now, what Dr. Mishra is teaching is very nice. He is teaching that, first of all, you must know who am I. That's very good. But that who am I can be known from the Bhagavad Gita. Also, I'm not this body. And sometimes a guest suddenly speaks out with an irrelevant question, and the Swami patiently tries to consider it. Yet, behind his tolerance, Prabhupada's mood is always one of urgency. Sometimes he talks quickly, and one senses his desire to establish Krishna consciousness in the West as soon as possible. So it's almost getting close to a year now. So Krishna consciousness is not established. So there is an urgency. He has no followers, only few books, no temples, and openly states that he is racing against time. I'm an old man. I could leave at any time. So behind the formal delivery of Krishna conscious philosophy is an anxiety, an almost desperate desire to convince at least one soul to take up Krishna consciousness immediately. Now, the constrained situations of Butler and the Anandashram and Dr. Mishra are behind him. He is free to speak about the absolute truth in full. Throughout his life, he was prepared for this, yet he is still discovering the best ways to present Krishna exploring his Western audience, testing their reactions. We should always remember that he is God. He is all powerful. In strength, no one could conquer him. In beauty, as far as beauty is concerned, when he was on the battlefield, have any of you seen a picture of Krishna? Have you seen? Have any of you ever seen Krishna? Oh, no. Prabhupada's voice fades as he pauses, looking out at his audience. No one has ever seen Krishna. None of them have slightest previous knowledge of Lord Krishna. In India, hundreds of millions of worship Lord Krishna daily as the eternal form of all beauty, truth, and view his graceful form in sculpture, painting, and dance. His philosophical teachings in Bhagavad Gita are all famous, and Prabhupada is his intimate emissary. Yet the ladies and gentlemen, room 307, look back at the Swami blankly. Prabhupada is discussing the real meaning of a place, real meaning of going to a sacred place in India. He says, one should go to a sacred place in order to find some intelligent scholar in the spiritual knowledge living there and make association with him. Just like my residence is at Vrindavan. So at Vrindavan, there are many big scholars, saintly persons living. So one should go to such holy places, not to simply take bath in the water. One must be intelligent enough to find some spiritually advanced man living there and take instruction from him and be benefited by that. If a man has attachment for going to a place of pilgrimage to take a bath, but has no attraction for hearing from learned people there, he is considered to be an ass. He loves. Saiveva go kara. Go means cow and kara means ass. So the whole civilization is moving like a civilization of cows and asses. Everyone is identified with their body. Yes, you want to speak? So there in the woman in the audience, she says, in the places known as secret places, proper sacred, yes. Yeah, is it sacred places? Proper says, yes. The woman says, is it also a fact that there is more magnetism because of the meeting of saints and more advanced people? Prabhupada, oh yes, certainly. Therefore, the place itself has got some magnetism. Woman, yes, and when? Prabhupada, just like at Vrindavan, that's practical. Here I am now sitting in New York, the world's greatest city, such a magnificent city, but my heart is always hankering after that Vrindavan. Woman, yes, loves. Prabhupada, yes, I'm not happy here. Woman, yes, I know. Prabhupada, I shall be very happy to return to my Vrindavan, the sacred place. But then why are you here now? Because it's my duty. I have brought some message for you people. Because I have been ordered by my superior, my spiritual master. Whatever you have learned, you should go to the Western countries and you must distribute this knowledge. So in spite of all my difficulties, all my inconveniences, I'm here. Because I'm obliged to my duty. If I go and sit down in Vrindavan, that will be good for my personal conveniences. I shall be very comfortable there and I will have no anxiety, nothing of the sort. But I have taken all the risk in this old age because I'm duty bound. I am duty bound. So I have to execute my duty despite all my inconveniences. But then an outsider opens the door and hesitatingly glances inside. Prabhupada stopping his lecture, he says, yes, come in. You can come here. Robert Nelson was like a slow, simple country boy with a homespun manner. Even though he had grown up in New York City, he was 20 years old. He wasn't part of the growing hippie movement. He did not take marijuana or other drugs, and he did not socialize much. He was a loner, and he had gotten some technical education at Staten Island Community College and had tried his hand at the record manufacturing business, but without much success. He was interested in God and would attend various spiritual meetings around the city. So one night he wandered in the Yoga Society to hear Dr. Mishra's lecture, and there he saw Prabhupada for the first time, Robert. So Swami was sitting cross-legged on a bench. There was a meeting and Dr. Mishra was standing up before a group of people. There were about 50 people coming there. And he talked on I am consciousness. Dr. Mishra talked and then gave Swami a grand introduction with a big smile. Swamiji is here. He said, and he swings around and waves his hand before a big introduction. It was beautiful. This was after Dr. Mishra spoke for about an hour. The Swami did not speak. He sang a song. Afterward, I went up to him. He had a big smile and he said that he likes young people to take to Krishna consciousness. He was very serious about it. He wanted all young people. So I thought that was very nice. It made sense. So I wanted to help. So we stood there talking for about an hour. Mishra had a public library in the back and we looked at certain books. Arjuna, Krishna, chariots and things. And then we walked around. He looked at some of the pictures of Swamis on the wall. By that time, it was getting very late. And Prabhupada said, come back the next day and at 10 to his office downstairs. Okay, some more paragraphs in the last stretch of the chapter. Next day, when Robert Nelson went to room 307, Prabhupada invited him in.
Prabhu, did you want someone else to read?
Yeah, Mata, you can read.
Okay, sure, yeah.
Otherwise, I can continue. But yeah.
That's okay, I'll read for some time.
Uh-huh.
The next day, when Robert Nelson went to room 307, Prabhupada invited him in. The room was clearly not intended to serve as a living quarters. There was no toilet, shower, chair,
No
bed,
toilet also, my bad.
The walls were painted a dark, dismal color. Prabhupada showed Robert the 3-volume set of Srimad Bhagavatam, which Robert purchased for $1,650. Then Prabhupada handed him a small piece of paper with the Hare Krishna mantra printed on it. Robert, while Swamiji was handing it to me, he had this big smile on his face, like he was handing me the world. We spent the whole day together. At one point, he said, "We are going to take a sleep." So he lay down there by his little desk, and so I said, "I'm tired too." So I lay down at the other end of the room and we rested. I just lay on the floor. It was the only place to do it. But he didn't rest that long, an hour and a half, I think. And we spent the rest of the day together. He was talking about Lord Chaitanya and the Lord's pastimes. And he showed me a small picture of Lord Chaitanya. Then he started talking about the devotees of Lord Chaitanya, Nityananda and Advaita. He had a picture of the 5 of them and a picture of his spiritual master. He said some things in Sanskrit and then he translated. It wasn't much of a room, though. You'd really be disappointed if you saw it. Robert Nelson couldn't give Prabhupada the kind of assistance he needed. Lord Chaitanya states that a person has at his command 4 assets: his life, money, intelligence, and words, at least one of which he should give to the service of God. Robert Nelson did not seem able to give his whole life to Krishna consciousness. And as for money, he had very little. His intelligence was also limited. And he spoke unimpressively, nor did he have a wide range of friends or contacts among whom to speak. But he was affectionate towards the Swami. And out of the 8 million people in the city, he was practically the only one who showed personal interest in him and offered to help. From his experience in the record business, Mr. Robert, as Swamiji called him, developed a scheme to produce a record of Swamiji's singing. People were always putting out albums with almost anything on them, he explained, and they would always make money, or at least break even. So it would be impossible to lose money. It was a way he thought he could help the Swami, he could help make the Swami known. And he tried to convince Prabhupada of the idea. And Prabhupada didn't discourage Mr. Robert, who seemed eager to render this service. Robert, me and the Swami went around to this record company on 46th Street. We went there and I started talking. And the man was all business. He was all business and mean. They go together. So he went in there with a tape and we tried talking to the man. Swami was talking, but the man said he couldn't put the tape out. I think he listened to the tape, but he couldn't put it out. So we felt discouraged, but he didn't say much about it. Prabhupada had been in business in India, and he wasn't about to think that he could suddenly take up business in a foreign country on the advice of a young boy in New York City. Besides, he had come not to do business, but to preach. Robert, however, was enthusiastically offering service. Perhaps he couldn't become a regular brahmachari student, but he had a desire to serve Krishna. For Prabhupada to refuse him would be perhaps to turn away an interested Western young person. Prabhupada had come to speak about Krishna, to present the chanting, and if Mr. Robert wanted to help by arranging for an American record album, then that was welcome. Mr. Robert and the Swami made an odd combination. Prabhupada was elderly and dignified, a deep scholar of the Bhagavatam and the Sanskrit language, whereas Robert Nelson was artless, even in Western culture, and inept in worldly ways. Together they would walk, the Swami wearing his winter coat with its imitation fur collar, his Indian dhoti, and white pointed shoes. Mr. Robert wearing old khaki pants and an old coat. Prabhupada walked with rapid, determined steps, outpacing the lumbering, rambling, heavy-set boy who had befriended him. Mr. Robert was supposed to help Prabhupada in making presentations to businessmen and real estate men. Yet he himself was hardly a slick fellow. He was innocent. Robert, once we went over to this big office building on 42nd Street, and we went in there. The rent was thousands of dollars for a whole floor. So I was standing there talking to the man, but I didn't understand how all this money would come. The Swami wanted a big place, but I didn't know what to tell the man. Prabhupada wanted a big place, and a big place meant a big price. He had no money, and Robert Nelson had only his unemployment checks. Still, Prabhupada was interested. If he were to find a building, that would be a great step in his mission. And this was also another way of engaging Mr. Robert. Besides, Krishna might do anything, give anything, or work in any way, ordinary or miraculous. So Prabhupada had his reasoning, and Mr. Robert had his. Robert, the building was between 6th and Broadway on 42nd Street. Some place to open Krishna's temple. We went in and up to the second floor and saw the renting agent. And then we left. I think it was 5,000 a month or 10,000 a month. We got to a certain point and the money was too much. And then we left. When he brought up the prices, I figured we had better not. We had to stop. On another occasion, Robert Nelson took Prabhupada by bus to the Hotel Columbia at 70 West 46th Street. The hotel had a suite that Prabhupada looked at for possible use as a temple. But again, it was very expensive and there was no money. Sometimes Robert would make purchases for Prabhupada with the money from his unemployment checks. Once he brought orange-colored t-shirts. Once he went to Woolworths and bought kitchen pots and pans and some picture frames for Prabhupada's pictures of Lord Chaitanya and his spiritual master. Robert, one time I wanted to know how to make chapati cakes. So Swami says, $100 please for the recipe. $100 please. So I went and got some money, but I couldn't get $100. But he showed me anyway. He taught me to cook and would always repeat, wash hands, and you should only eat with your right hand. And whoever met the Swami was almost always impressed. They would start smiling back to him, and sometimes they would say funny things to each other that were nice. The Swami's English was very technical always. I mean, he had a big vocabulary. But sometimes people had a little trouble understanding him, and you had to help sometimes. At the Paradox, at 64 East 7th Street on the Lower East Side was a restaurant dedicated to the philosophy of George Osawa and the macrobiotic diet. It was a storefront below street level with small dining tables around the candlelit room. The food was inexpensive and well reputed. Tea was served free as much as you liked. More than just a restaurant, the Paradox was a center for spiritual and cultural interests, a meeting place reminiscent of the cafes of Greenwich, Greenwich Village or Paris in the 1920s. A person could spend the whole day at the Paradox without buying anything, and no one would complain. The crowd at the Paradox was a mystical congregation interested in teachings from the West. When news of the new Swami uptown at Dr. Mishra's reached the Paradox, the word spread quickly. Harvey Cohen and Bill Epstein were friends. Harvey was a freelance artist and Bill worked at the Paradox. After Harvey had been to Prabhupada's place at Dr. Mishra's yoga studio a few times, he came by the Paradox and began to describe all about the new Swami to Bill and other friends. Bill, I was working at the Paradox one night when Harvey came to me and said, I went to visit Mishra and there's a new Swami there and he's really fantastic. Well, I was involved in macrobiotics and Buddhism, so at first I couldn't care less. But Harvey was a winning and warm personality and he seemed interested in this. He said, why don't you come uptown? I would like you to see this. So I went to one of the lectures on 72nd Street. I walked in there and I could feel a certain presence from the Swami. He had a certain very concentrated, intense appearance. He looked pale and kind of weak. I guess he had just come here and he had been through a lot of things. He was sitting there chanting on his beads, which he carried in a little bead bag. One of Dr. Mishra's students was talking, and he finally got around to introducing the Swami. He said, we are the moons to the Swami's sun. He introduced him in that way. The Swami got up and talked. I didn't know what to think about it. At that time, the only steps I had taken in regard to Indian teaching were through Ramakrishna. But this was the first time, to my knowledge, that bhakti religion had come to America. Bill Epstein, quite in contrast to Robert Nelson, was a dashing romantic person with long, wavy, dark hair and a beard. He was good-looking and effervescent and took upon himself a role of informing people at the restaurant of the city's spiritual news. Once he became interested in the new Swami, he made the Swami an ongoing topic of conversation at the restaurant. Bill, I went in the back and asked Richard, the manager, I'm going to take some food to the Swami. You don't mind, do you? He said, no, take whatever you want. Take anything you want. So I took some brown rice and other stuff and I brought it up there. I went upstairs and I knocked on the door and there was no answer. I knocked again and I saw that the light was on because it had a glass panel. And finally he answered. I was really scared because I had never really accepted any teacher. He said, come in, sit down. We started talking and he said to me, the first thing that people do when they meet is to show each other love. They exchange names, they exchange something to eat. So he gave me a slice of apple and he showed me the tape recorder. He showed me the tape recorder he had, probably for recording his chants. Then he said, have you ever chanted? I said, no, I haven't chanted before. So he played a chant and then he spoke to me some more time. He said, you must come back. I said, well, if I come back, I'll bring you some more food. James Green, a 30-year-old carpentry teacher at Cooper Union, was delving into Eastern philosophy. He lived on the same block as the Paradox and began hearing about the Swami from Harvey Cohen and Bill Epstein while regularly taking his evening meal at the restaurant. James, it was really Harvey and Bill who got things going. I remember one evening at Mishra's in which Swamiji was only a presence but did not speak. Mishra students seemed more into the bodily aspects of yoga. This seemed to be one of Swamiji's complaints. His room on 72nd Street was quite small. He was living in a fairly narrow room with a door on the one end. Swamiji would set himself up along one side, and we were rather closely packed. It may have been no more than 8 feet wide, and it was rather dim. He sat on this thin mattress, and then we sat on the floor. We couldn't chant. We would just come, and he would lecture. There was no direction other than the lecture on the Bhagavad Gita. I had read a lot of literature, and in my own shy way, I was looking for a master. I think I have no aggression in me or go-getting quality. I was really just a listener, and this seemed right, hearing the Bhagavad Gita. So I kept coming. It just seemed as if things would grow from there. More and more people began coming. Then it got crowded, and we had to find another place. The new group from the Paradox was young and hip, in contrast to the older, more conservative uptown people who had been attending Prabhupada's classes. In those days, it was still unusual to see a person with long hair and a beard, and when such people started coming to the Swami's meetings on the west side, some of the older people were alarmed. As one of them noted, Swami Bhaktivedanta began to pick up another kind of people. He picked them up at the brewery or some attics. And they came with funny hats and gray blankets wrapped around themselves, and they startled me. David Allen, a 21-year-old seeker who came up from the Paradox, had just moved to the city, optimistically attracted by what he had read about experimentation with drugs. He saw the old group as a kind of fuss-budgety group of older women on the west side, listening to the Swami's lectures. David, we weren't known as hippies then, but it was strange for the people who had originally been attracted to him. It was different for them to relate to this new group. I think most of the teachers from India up to that time had older followers, and sometimes wealthy widows would provide a source of income. But Swamiji changed right away to the younger, poorer group of people. The next thing that happened was that Bill Epstein and others began talking about how it would be better for the Swami to come downtown to the Lower East Side. Things were really happening down there, and somehow they weren't happening uptown. People downtown really needed him. Downtown was right, and it was ripe. There was life down there. There was a lot of energy going around.
That's it.
Oh.
On the Bowery, chapter 17.
Chapter 17. Okay, on the Bowery.
Tomorrow.
Okay. Oh, Prabhupada's typewriter and tape recorder got stolen.
Mm.
It's amazing.
Mataji?
No, I was saying it's amazing. I mean, how he, I was actually thinking for the fundraising, I was trying to recruit people with very little success. And I was thinking Prabhupada gave up everything and gave his whole life there to recruit devotees.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
I was thinking how he started the preaching. Because these are the monumental times. It's the beginning.
Yeah.
To the foreign people, foreign language, and all that, foreign land.
Yep.
Okay. Anisha Mataji, Banita Mataji, Priyanka Mataji, want to say anything?
Sorry, Prabhuji, no, like I was hearing, but yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Prabhu. I was really appreciating the gesture of Prabhupada, how he was treating to the people who are coming. Like first, he just don't jump into any philosophical things or nothing. First, he would treat with love. He would share, and then he will give the prasadam, whatever he has, apple, whatever he have. So I love the gesture the Prabhupada is showing, and those people were really, really fortunate to have Prabhupada's prasadam from his hands. It's very nice. And he was very bold actually when people were inquiring about Guru or someone else or something. He's very bold in saying the truth. Not even like there's was when you were reading, there was a explanation about talking about the ass and everything. So he was not at all like scared of talking, but he was just saying it so bold, whatever it is. I really liked it. So
Yeah. Nice.
yeah.
That's it. So the episode of asking everyone to help is done. So he's taking everything on his shoulder and is marching, and he's going to establish ISKCON. It took almost a year. Yeah, breaking grounds. Okay, Hare Krishna, everyone. See you tomorrow.